The tarmac shimmered under a punishing California sun, heat waves distorting the silhouettes of aircraft lined up like silent sentinels along the runway. Inside the terminal at Edwards Air Force Base, a woman stood apart from the crowd, her presence an anomaly that drew stares and whispered comments. Her clothes hung loose, layers that spoke of nights spent under overpasses rather than under roof beams. Her hair, once maintained with military precision, now fell in uneven strands around a face weathered by more than just age. She clutched a duffel bag against her chest, the fabric worn thin at the corners, and her boots, though clean, showed the kind of damage that came from miles walked on concrete rather than flight deck steel. Nobody recognized Lieutenant Commander Rhiannon Vesper Cross. Not anymore. The woman who had once commanded respect in ready rooms across 3 continents now inspired only discomfort and barely concealed disgust. A young airman first class made a show of moving his belongings away from where she stood. 2 civilian contractors whispered behind their hands, one of them pointing with a coffee cup. The base security officer watched her with the particular intensity reserved for those deemed potential problems, his hand resting casually but deliberately near his radio. Vesper had learned not to meet their eyes. She had learned that engagement only made things worse, that explanation was a luxury afforded to those who still possessed credibility. So she stood in her corner of the terminal and waited, her boarding pass gripped in fingers that trembled slightly despite her best efforts. The pass was real, the authorization legitimate. But legitimacy meant nothing when measured against appearance, against the silent judgment that radiated from every uniformed person in that space. The flight to Nelly's Air Force Base was routine, a transport run that happened twice daily. Vesper had been granted passage through channels she barely understood anymore, paperwork processed by advocates she'd never met, part of a veteran outreach program whose acronym she couldn't quite remember. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in 8 months, she would be back on a military installation, back in a world that had once been the only home she'd ever known. A major walked past, his flight suit crisp and his demeanor radiating the kind of confidence that came with active duty status. He glanced at Vesper, then away, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been pity before settling into professional indifference. He said nothing. Nobody said anything. The terminal hummed with conversation that carefully flowed around her like water around a stone. Outside, a C-130 Hercules was being prepped for departure, its 4 turboprop engines undergoing final checks. The loadmaster consulted his manifest, checking names against faces as passengers began to board. When Vesper approached with her pass extended, he studied it longer than necessary, his eyes moving from the document to her face and back again. Protocol demanded he allow her aboard. Everything else about the situation demanded he find a reason to refuse. He stepped aside. She climbed the ramp into the cargo hold, where canvas seats lined the walls and the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with jet fuel created an odor that was, to Vesper, more familiar than perfume had ever been. She found a seat near the rear, away from the others, and buckled herself in with movements that were automatic muscle memory from thousands of flights, refusing to fade despite everything else that had been lost. The other passengers boarded in clusters, their conversations filling the hold with echoes. A lieutenant made eye contact with Vesper and immediately looked away. 2 enlisted men chose seats on the opposite side despite empty spaces closer. The isolation was complete without being explicitly enforced, a social quarantine maintained through unspoken consensus. The loadmaster completed his count, secured the ramp, and gave the thumbs up to the cockpit. The engines spooled up, their distinctive whine building to a roar that Vesper felt in her chest. She closed her eyes. For just a moment, she let herself remember what it had been like to be the one in the cockpit, to feel the stick in her hand and the aircraft responding to her will like an extension of her own body. The C-130 lumbered down the runway and lifted into the cloudless sky, banking east toward Nevada. Below, The Mojave Desert spread out in endless variations of brown and gray, punctuated by the geometric precision of military installations and the wandering lines of highways that connected nowhere to nowhere. Vesper pressed her forehead against the small window, watching the ground fall away, watching the world become abstract and manageable from altitude. She must have dozed because the next thing she registered was a change in the engine note, a subtle shift that spoke of altitude adjustment. They were beginning their descent into Nellies. Around her, passengers were gathering their belongings, checking phones, preparing to return to whatever duties awaited them. Vesper had no duties. She had an appointment at the base hospital, part of the outreach program, a psychological evaluation that would determine her eligibility for further assistance. After that, she had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to do. The landing was smooth, professional. The C-130 taxied to its designated spot, and the ramp lowered to reveal the distinctive landscape of Nellies, with its endless rows of fighters and the mountains rising beyond like ancient judges. The passengers filed out into the Nevada heat, dispersing immediately toward their separate destinations. Vesper emerged last, squinting against the sun, and found herself alone on the tarmac except for the ground crew already beginning their post-flight inspection. She consulted a crumpled paper with directions to the hospital, oriented herself, and began walking. The base was enormous and the hospital was on the far side. It would take time. She had nothing but time. She had covered perhaps 200 yards when she heard it. The sound of multiple aircraft engines spooling up simultaneously, not the steady turboprops of cargo planes but the sharp whine of fighter jets. She turned, instinctively locating the source, and saw 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons taxiing in formation toward the runway. They moved with predatory grace, their gray paint schemes designed to disappear against cloud and sky, their weapons pylons empty in what must have been a training exercise. Vesper stopped walking. She couldn't help it. For 8 months she had been divorced from this world, but the part of her that was a pilot, that had always been a pilot since before she could articulate what that meant, rose up with painful intensity. She watched the F-16s line up. She watched them receive clearance. She watched them unleash their full power and tear down the runway in intervals, each one rotating skyward with the kind of acceleration that defied intuition, that made mockery of gravity. The third aircraft had just lifted off when the radio traffic changed. Vesper didn't have a radio, had no access to the tower frequency, but she knew the rhythms of military aviation the way a musician knows when a note is wrong. Something in the pattern of activity around her shifted. Ground crew members paused in their work. A staff sergeant grabbed his radio and listened intently, his body language transforming from casual to alert in an instant. Then she heard it, distant but unmistakable, the electronic warble of an emergency klaxon cutting through the ambient noise of the flight line. Heads turned. Vehicles began moving with sudden purpose. Somewhere, something had gone wrong. Vesper's first instinct was to move toward the sound, toward the crisis, but she checked herself. She was a homeless veteran with no authority, no clearance, no standing whatsoever. Whatever was happening, it was none of her concern. She turned back toward the hospital, forcing herself to resume walking, forcing herself to remember that she was no longer part of this machine. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when a Humvee screeched to a stop beside her, its tires kicking up dust. The driver was a master sergeant with graying temples and eyes that had seen too many emergencies. He stared at Vesper with an expression that combined urgency with confusion. "Your Vesper Cross," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded slowly, uncertain what this meant. "Get in," he said. "They need you at the tower now." The tower loomed above the main terminal complex, a glass and concrete structure that commanded views of the entire airfield. Vesper followed the master sergeant through security checkpoints that should have stopped her but didn't, past airmen who stared but didn't question, upstairs that her tired legs protested climbing. The sergeant said nothing, offered no explanation, just kept moving with the single-minded purpose of someone following orders that permitted no deviation. They burst through the door into the tower cab, and Vesper was immediately overwhelmed by the controlled chaos that filled the space. Controllers hunched over scopes, their voices overlapping in the compressed language of air traffic management. The tower chief, a lieutenant colonel with command pilot wings and a face carved from granite, stood at the center of it all, a radio handset pressed to his ear. He looked up as Vesper entered, and something flickered across his features. Recognition, definitely. Something else, harder to name. He covered the handset's microphone and addressed her directly. "Vesper Cross, you're checked out in F-16s. Again, not a question. She nodded. "Yes, sir, 4 years ago. My certification is expired and I'm not." "We have an emergency," he interrupted. "Lieutenant Hayes took off 17 minutes ago on a routine training sortie. Solo flight. He's 23 years old, 70 hours in type, and approximately 5 minutes ago he reported a catastrophic systems failure. Flight controls are degraded, hydraulics are failing, and his ejection system is showing a malfunction indicator." Vesper's stomach dropped. She knew exactly what that combination meant. "He can't eject." "He can't eject," the lieutenant colonel confirmed. "And he doesn't have the experience to bring a crippled aircraft down safely. His instructor pilot is wheels up in 3 minutes, but by the time he reaches Hayes's position and talks him through the landing sequence, Hayes will be out of fuel or out of altitude. Probably both." "I don't understand what you need from me, sir." The lieutenant colonel's expression was grim. "We need someone who can talk him through this immediately. Someone who knows the F-16 systems intimately. Someone who's been through emergencies and survived them." He paused. "We pulled your record. You landed a damaged F-16 aboard the USS Ronald Reagan in a storm with no nose gear and failing engines. You've logged more emergency procedures than most pilots see in a career. You're also the only person on this base right now who's not actively flying who has that experience." Vesper looked around the tower cab, at the controllers monitoring their scopes, at the master sergeant who had brought her here, at the lieutenant colonel who was asking the impossible. "Sir, I'm not in any condition to." "I'm not asking you to fly," he cut her off. "I'm asking you to talk. Can you do that?" Through the tower's windows, she could see the runway, the desert beyond, the mountains in the distance. Somewhere up there, a young pilot was fighting for his life in a machine that was failing him piece by piece. She thought about refusing. She thought about all the reasons she was the wrong choice, about how far she had fallen, about how little credibility she possessed. Then she thought about what it felt like to be alone in a cockpit when everything went wrong, to know that survival depended on making the right decisions in sequence while the aircraft tried to kill you. She thought about being 23 years old and terrified, waiting for someone, anyone, to help. "I can talk," she said quietly. The lieutenant colonel handed her a headset. "His call sign is Torch 24. You're on guard frequency. He's circling 20 miles west, burning fuel, trying to troubleshoot. You need to convince him to stop troubleshooting and start preparing for an emergency landing while he still has options." Vesper settled the headset over her ears and adjusted the microphone. The familiar weight was both comforting and surreal, like encountering a ghost of her former self. She keyed the transmit button, and for the first time in 8 months, she spoke with the voice of a naval aviator. "Torch 24, this is Nellie's Tower, emergency frequency. How do you copy?" Static hissed. Then, "Nellie's Tower, Torch 24, I copy you 5 by 5. Who am I speaking with?" The voice was young, male, and trying very hard not to sound as scared as he clearly was. "Torch 24, call me Vesper. I'm going to help you bring your aircraft home. What's your current status?" "Vesper, I've got multiple warnings here. Hydraulic pressure is in the red, flight controls are mushy as hell, and my master caution is lit up like a Christmas tree. I've been running the emergency checklist but nothing's improving, and my ejection seat is showing a fault. tower's telling me not to try ejecting." "That's correct, Torch," Vesper said, keeping her voice calm and level. "Ejection is not an option, but that's okay because we're not going to need it. You're going to land that aircraft. Talk me through your hydraulic readings. What are your System A and B pressures showing?" As the young pilot read off his gauges, Vesper closed her eyes and visualized the F-16 systems. The hydraulic architecture was complex but logical, two independent systems that could be individually isolated if one failed. She listened to the numbers and immediately understood the problem. System A was completely offline, and System B was degrading. That meant his flight controls were operating on minimal pressure, which explained the mushy response he was reporting. "Okay, Torch, here's what's happening," she said. "You've lost System A entirely and B is dying. That means your control inputs are going to require more force and the aircraft's going to respond slower than you're used to. Have you reduced your airspeed?" "I'm at 350 knots. Too fast. You need to slow down to 250. Reduced speed means reduced aerodynamic forces, which means your degraded controls will be more effective. Gentle throttle reduction, no sudden movements. Remember, the aircraft wants to fly. You're just along to guide it." She could hear him breathing over the radio, could hear the tension in each breath. But he acknowledged the instruction, and she could imagine him carefully pulling the throttle back, feeling the aircraft decelerate, fighting his instinct to keep speed as a safety margin. The tower chief was watching her intently. Around the cab, every controller had stopped what they were doing to listen. The master sergeant stood by the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Vesper, I'm at 250 knots. Controls feel a little better, still pretty heavy though." "Good job, Torch. Now I need you to do something that's going to feel counterintuitive. I need you to stop trying to troubleshoot the problem. Everything you need to do from this point forward is about preparing to land. Your troubleshooting time is over. Do you understand?" A pause then, "But if I can fix the hydraulics?" "You can't," Vesper said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Whatever failed is beyond your ability to repair in flight. What you can do is control the variables you still have influence over: airspeed, altitude, approach angle, and landing configuration. Those are your tools now. Accept that the aircraft is damaged and focus on flying it to the ground safely. Can you do that?" Another pause, longer this time. She could imagine the internal struggle, the pilot's natural instinct to fix problems warring with the need to accept reality. Finally, "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." "Outstanding. Now, what's your current altitude and position?" "I'm at 12,000 feet, orbiting at the initial point 20 miles west of the field. I've got maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining." 20 minutes. More than enough if everything went perfectly. Barely enough if anything else went wrong. Vesper did the calculations in her head, factoring in the approach time, the need to configure the aircraft for landing, the margin for error. It would be tight. "All right, Torch, here's what we're going to do," she said. "You're going to fly an extended straighten approach. No tactical breaks, no fancy patterns. Just a long, stable descent all the way to touchdown. I'm going to talk you through every step and you're going to follow my instructions exactly. Your instructor is en route, but I'm with you right now, and I promise you I'm going to get you on the ground. Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air. Through the tower windows, Vesper could see emergency vehicles beginning to position themselves along the runway, fire trucks and ambulances arranging themselves in patterns that had been rehearsed countless times. The crash recovery team was suiting up. The base hospital would be on alert. Everyone was preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. "I trust you," the young pilot said, and Vesper heard something in his voice shift. He had made his decision. He was committing to the process. "Good man. First step, I need you to turn inbound and begin a descent to 8,000 feet. Descent rate of 500 feet per minute, no more. Use pitch control, keep your power setting stable. Call out when you're level at 8. Turning inbound, beginning descent. 500 feet per minute. Vesper glanced at the tower chief, who was coordinating with his controllers to clear all traffic from the airspace. Every other aircraft in the vicinity was being directed away, leaving the sky empty except for one struggling F-16 and the pilot trying to save it. Torch, while you're descending, I want you to start thinking about your landing configuration. Normally, you'd put your gear down at a 1.5 final. We're not doing that. You're keeping your gear up until you're absolutely committed to landing. The gear system uses hydraulic pressure to extend, and we need to conserve every bit of System B pressure for flight control. Understand? Gear stays up until final, roger that. Flaps are the same story. You've got 3 flap settings on the F-16, up, maneuvering, and landing. We're going to land with flaps up. It'll mean a higher approach speed and longer landing roll, but it eliminates another hydraulic demand. You're going to touch down fast, but the runway here is 11,000 feet. We've got room. Flaps up landing, understood. The lieutenant colonel leaned in close to Vesper. You're planning a no-flap, late-gear emergency approach. It's the only way to preserve his remaining hydraulics for control authority, she replied quietly. If he loses System B completely before touchdown, he's dead regardless of gear or flap configuration. This way he has a chance. The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly. It was an aggressive plan, one that pushed risk onto the landing itself rather than the approach, but it was also sound. He stepped back and let her continue. Vesper, I'm level at 8,000 feet. Fuel is at 15 minutes. Copy that, Torch. You're doing great. Now I need you to visualize your approach. You're going to fly a 3-degree glide slope, which is standard ILS. At 8,000 feet, you're about 24 miles from touchdown. Your descent rate at 3 degrees is approximately 700 feet per minute at your current speed. You're going to follow this profile all the way down, making small corrections as needed. No big control inputs. Smooth and steady wins the race. Through the radio, she heard him acknowledge. She heard the tension in his voice, but also something else: focus. He was in the zone now, the place where pilots lived when everything else fell away except the immediate demands of flight. Vesper knew that place intimately. It was the only place where she had ever felt truly at home. Minutes passed in a strange compression of time where each second felt both infinite and instantaneous. Vesper walked the young pilot through each phase of the approach, coaching him on power settings, on maintaining his glide slope, on small corrections to his flight path. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the tower on her, could sense their collective tension, but it faded into background noise. Right now there were only 2 people who mattered, her and the pilot she was trying to save. Vesper, I'm at 4,000 feet, 10 miles out. Fuel is at 8 minutes. Perfect, Torch. You're right on profile. At 3 miles, I want you to drop your gear. Call out when you have 3 green lights. Roger, gear at 3 miles, 3 green lights. The tower chief was coordinating with the emergency crews, ensuring they were ready. The crash recovery team was in position. Medical personnel were standing by. Everything that could be prepared was prepared. Now it came down to the pilot and the aircraft and the narrow margin between success and catastrophe. Vesper, I'm at 3 miles, dropping gear now. A pause that stretched for heartbeats. Vesper held her breath without meaning to. The gear system was entirely hydraulic. If System B failed during extension, the gear might not lock down properly. An unlocked gear meant an almost certain crash. I've got 3 green lights. Gear is down and locked. Relief washed through the tower cab like a physical wave. The lieutenant colonel let out a breath he'd been holding. Controllers exchanged glances. The master sergeant uncrossed his arms, but Vesper didn't allow herself to relax. They weren't done yet. Outstanding job, Torch. Now listen carefully. With your gear down, your drag has increased significantly. You're going to need to add power to maintain your glide slope. Don't let your nose drop. Pitch for speed, power for altitude. Remember your fundamentals. Adding power, maintaining glide slope. 2 miles. How are your controls feeling? Heavy, really heavy. It's taking a lot of force to make corrections. That was the hydraulic pressure continuing to degrade. System B was dying just as she'd predicted, but they were close now, so close. You're doing fine, Torch. Keep flying the aircraft. 1 mile. Start looking for the runway environment. Call the field in sight. Field in sight. Good. Half-mile. You're going to feel an urge to flare early because of your high approach speed. Don't. Maintain your descent rate until you're over the threshold, then normal flare. Let the aircraft settle onto the runway. Don't force it. Roger, maintaining descent rate. Through the tower windows, Vesper could see the F-16 now, a distant speck that grew rapidly into the distinctive shape of the Fighting Falcon, gear extended, approaching fast and flat. The emergency vehicles tracked its progress, ready to roll the instant anything went wrong. Quarter-mile, looking good, Torch. The F-16 crossed the threshold at what looked like an insane speed, faster than any normal landing, but Vesper had calculated the approach and she knew it was right. The pilot held his descent, held his nerve, and at the last possible moment pulled back on the stick with both hands, forcing the sluggish controls to respond, bleeding off energy in the flare. The main gear touched first with a chirp of rubber on concrete. The nose gear followed a second later. The aircraft rolled down the runway, fast but straight, the pilot riding the brakes carefully, bringing 9 tons of wounded fighter to a controlled stop with 3,000 feet of runway still remaining. The tower cab erupted in spontaneous applause. Controllers cheered. The master sergeant was grinning. The lieutenant colonel was nodding with satisfaction, already reaching for his phone to call off the emergency. Through it all, Vesper stood motionless, the headset still on her ears, listening as the young pilot keyed his radio one final time. Torch 24 is on deck, shutting down. A pause, then, Vesper, I don't know who you are, but thank you. You saved my life. She keyed the transmit button but found she couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up, her eyes were burning, and her hands were shaking in a way they hadn't during the entire emergency. Finally, she managed. You saved your own life, Torch. You did the work. I just talked you through it. Good flying. She pulled off the headset and handed it back to the lieutenant colonel, who was looking at her with an expression that had transformed completely from when she'd first entered the tower. The judgment was gone. The doubt was gone. What remained was something closer to respect. That was exceptional, he said quietly. I don't know your full story, Commander Cross, but what I just witnessed was the work of a professional aviator at the top of her game. Whatever brought you to this point, you still have it. You understand that. Vesper didn't know how to respond. For 8 months she had believed she had nothing left, that the pilot she had been was gone forever, buried under loss and trauma and the grinding weight of circumstance. But for 20 minutes, talking to a frightened young pilot over the radio, she had been exactly who she used to be. The question was whether that mattered. Permission to leave, sir? She asked. The lieutenant colonel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Granted, but Commander, this isn't over. Someone's going to want to talk to you about what just happened. Someone important. Don't leave the base. She made her way back down the tower stairs, through the terminal, out into the Nevada heat. The adrenaline was draining from her system, leaving her shaky and exhausted. She found a bench in the shade and sat down, her duffel bag beside her, and tried to process what had just occurred. She had saved someone's life. After 8 months of feeling useless, of being treated as disposable, she had done something that mattered. But she also knew how the world worked. This would be a story people told, a dramatic moment that would circulate through the base and beyond. And then it would fade and she would still be homeless, still be lost, still be the woman people looked away from. Except something had shifted. She could feel it but not name it. Some fundamental assumption about who she was and what she was capable of had been challenged and proven wrong. The question was what, if anything, she could do with that knowledge. An hour later, A colonel from base operations found her still sitting on the bench. He introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Winters, and he had the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years in uniform and had learned to read people with precision. He sat down beside her without asking permission, close enough to speak privately but far enough to respect personal space. "Lieutenant Hayes wants to meet you," he said without preamble. "The pilot you talked down. He's over at the medical center getting checked out, but he's insisting on meeting the person who saved his life. Would you be willing?" Vesper shrugged. "I don't think that's a good idea, sir. He thinks I'm someone I'm not. He thinks you're a pilot who knows how to handle emergencies. Was he wrong?" "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," Colonel Winters said. His voice was quiet but firm. "You think that because you've fallen on hard times you're not worth knowing. You think your current circumstances define you. But I just reviewed your service record, Commander. 7 years of naval aviation, 3 combat deployments, 2 Navy Crosses and a Silver Star, more than 1,500 hours in tactical jets. You were one of the best pilots in your community before everything fell apart. And 20 minutes ago, you proved you still are." "I'm not in the Navy anymore, Colonel. I'm not in anything." "That's a temporary condition, not a permanent identity. The question isn't what you've lost. The question is what you're going to do next." He stood up, preparing to leave. "Lieutenant Hayes will be at the medical center until 1600 hours, Building 732. If you decide to go, security will let you through. If you don't, nobody's going to force you. But that kid deserves to say thank you to the person who saved him, and maybe you deserve to hear it." He walked away, leaving Vesper alone with her thoughts. The sun had moved across the sky, changing the angles of shadow and light. In the distance, she could hear aircraft engines, the endless rhythm of a working airbase. The sound had once been as natural to her as her own heartbeat. Now it felt like an echo from someone else's life. She thought about Lieutenant Hayes, young and scared and fighting for his life. She thought about the moment when he'd said, "I trust you," and how that trust had given him the courage to do what needed to be done. She thought about what it meant to be trusted when you no longer trusted yourself. Building 732 was a 20-minute walk. Vesper stood up, shouldered her duffel bag, and started walking. She wasn't sure what she would say to the young pilot. She wasn't sure why it mattered. But Colonel Winters had been right about one thing. He deserved to say thank you, and she deserved to hear it, even if she couldn't quite believe she had earned it. The medical center was a sprawling complex of single-story buildings connected by covered walkways. Security checked her name against a list, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and directed her to a consultation room on the east side. She found Lieutenant Hayes sitting in a chair, still wearing his flight suit, looking pale but intact. When she entered, he stood up immediately, and the gratitude in his expression was so raw and unguarded that Vesper had to look away. "Commander Cross," he said, "I'm Travis Hayes. I don't even know how to start thanking you." "You don't have to thank me," Vesper said quietly. "You did all the hard work. I just talked you through the process. You kept me calm. You knew exactly what to say and when to say it. When my instructor finally got on frequency, he said the approach you designed was textbook perfect. He said you made calls he wouldn't have thought of." Hayes shook his head. "I'm alive because you knew what you were doing. That deserves more than a thank you, but it's all I have to give." They talked for a few minutes, Hayes recounting the flight from his perspective, Vesper listening, and occasionally offering observations. It was strange being treated as a professional again, being spoken to with respect rather than pity or contempt. She had forgotten what that felt like. When she finally left the medical center, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Vesper walked without any particular destination, letting her feet carry her across the base. She passed buildings and hangars, watched aircraft take off and land, saw the carefully maintained machinery of military aviation continuing its eternal cycle. She found herself at the base chapel, a small structure with a simple cross mounted above the entrance. She wasn't particularly religious, had never been, but something drew her inside. The chapel was empty except for rows of wooden pews and an altar at the front. She sat in the back row and stared at nothing in particular, trying to understand what she was feeling. For 8 months she had been falling. Every day had been a struggle just to survive, just to find food and shelter and avoid the violence that came with being vulnerable on the streets. She had made peace with the idea that she would never climb back up, that the best she could hope for was to not fall any further. But now something had happened that didn't fit that narrative. She had been useful again. She had been competent again. For 20 minutes, she had been the pilot she used to be. The question was whether that meant anything, or whether it was just a momentary aberration, a brief flash of the past before reality reasserted itself, and she returned to being nobody of consequence. She sat in the chapel until the light through the windows faded to blue twilight, then made her way back to the terminal. Her appointment at the hospital had long since passed, and she had no idea what would happen next. Protocol suggested she would be escorted off base, returned to wherever she had come from, her brief moment of usefulness already forgotten. Instead, she found Colonel Winters waiting for her in the terminal lobby. He was holding a folder and wore the expression of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to defend it. "Commander Cross," he said, "we need to talk about your situation." She nodded slowly. Here it came, the polite dismissal, the "thank you for your service, now please leave" speech that she had heard in various forms more times than she could count. But that wasn't what he said. "You saved a pilot today," Colonel Winters began. "But more than that, you demonstrated skills and knowledge that this base desperately needs. We have young pilots coming through here constantly, fresh out of training, full of confidence and dangerously light on experience. Today proved that having someone like you available for situations like this isn't just helpful, it's potentially life-saving." He paused. "I've been on the phone for the last hour with some very senior people. We want to offer you a position." Vesper stared at him. "A position?" "A civilian contract position as an emergency aviation advisor. You wouldn't be flying, but you would be available for situations exactly like what happened today. You'd also work with our training squadron, offering perspective and expertise to new pilots. The pay isn't amazing, but it comes with base housing, medical benefits, and access to all base facilities." He held out the folder. "This is the complete proposal. I need you to understand that this isn't charity. We're offering this because you have value, because what you did today proved you still have something important to contribute." She took the folder with hands that shook slightly. Inside were official documents, salary information, housing details, benefit descriptions. It looked real. It looked legitimate. It looked like a lifeline thrown to someone who had been drowning for 8 months. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" "Because throwing away talent is wasteful," Colonel Winters said simply, "and because everyone deserves a second chance. Maybe especially people who have already given so much." He met her eyes. "The question is whether you're ready to take it. This would mean coming back into this world, being around aircraft and pilots every day, being reminded constantly of what you used to be. Some people would find that healing. Some would find it torture. I can't tell you which it would be for you." Vesper looked down at the folder, at the official Air Force letterhead, at her own name typed on documents that represented a path back to something resembling a life. She thought about Lieutenant Hayes, about the trust in his voice when he said he would follow her instructions. She thought about the feeling of talking on the radio again, of being useful again, of mattering. "I'll take it," she said quietly. Colonel Winters smiled, and it was genuine. "Good. Housing will be available tomorrow. Tonight, we've arranged a room at the Distinguished Visitor Quarters. Sergeant Kowalski will escort you there and make sure you have everything you need. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow and we'll get the paperwork finalized." He extended his hand. "Welcome back, Commander." She shook his hand, still half convinced this was some kind of elaborate dream that she would wake from to find herself back under an overpass somewhere. But the hand was solid, the folder was real, and the sergeant who appeared to escort her was treating her with professional courtesy rather than the wariness she had grown accustomed to. The distinguished visitor quarters were basic but clean, with a bed that had sheets and blankets, a bathroom with hot water, and a small desk by the window. Vesper stood in the doorway for a long,